Hi, I'm Ken Davis, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom. On today's show, the aftermath of the Jon Burge trial. The former police commander has been convicted in federal court, and he now faces a jail sentence. We'll talk today about the significance of Burge's conviction and the long-term consequences for the Chicago Police Department. Since 1990, journalist Jon Conroy has been documenting the criminal activities of Burge and his associates in Chicago Police Department Area 2. He was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Reader until 2007, and he's the author of 2 books. Jon Conroy, welcome to Chicago Newsroom.
Thanks for having me.
So I think it might be helpful to sort of go back and just take a quick look at where things stand in the Burge trial. Jon Burge has been convicted. He hasn't been sentenced yet, as I understand it. What exactly was he convicted of? What did the jury say he did wrong?
He was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice, and those charges were the result of his answers in a civil suit. The civil suit was filed in 2003 by a man named Madison Hobley, and the first step of a civil suit is to send your opponent, the person you're suing, written what are called interrogatories, and you respond in writing. So they're called written interrogatories, and Burge responded to these 2 documents, and in those 2 documents he denied knowing anything about torture, denied having seen anything resembling torture.
So this was a written document?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And thereafter he took the Fifth Amendment on anything important, but his lawyers basically made a mistake. Had they had him take the Fifth Amendment from the get-go, we would not now be talking about Jon Burge's conviction. This was all that was available to the federal prosecutors because the actual acts of which he's accused, torture, which in the law qualify as aggravated assault, the statute of limitation has long passed on those. So
that's something that I think may be lost on a lot of people, that Jon Burge was not on trial, this recent trial, because he allegedly tortured anybody. He was on trial because he lied.
That's correct. But in order to prove that he lied, the prosecution had to put on witnesses who said they'd been tortured. And they had to put on a police officer who said that he'd seen Jon Burge put something transparent over a man's face, which was corroborated by the man who said he'd been suffocated with the typewriter cover.
Now, at this point, he's been found guilty, but he has not been charged. That's not till, like, what, November or something?
He's been found guilty, but he hasn't been sentenced.
I'm sorry, I'm sentenced, I mean, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
And that happens in November. He faces up to 45 years. The actual sentence he'll get, of course, nobody knows. The prosecution will be asking for something significant, and the defense will be highlighting his long years of service and asking for something insignificant.
And that gives us an opportunity to actually kind of sort of pull back a little bit and look at this guy, Jon Burge. Jon Burge has become a kind of a symbol, I think, for people who want such a symbol of police misconduct, of torture and malfeasance and all sorts of other things. But you've written, and I guess we need to point out to our viewers that you have covered this story longer than any other living human being, because you were kind of there at the first trial when this came up, and so you are a kind of a repository of a great deal of knowledge about this trial, and you've had the opportunity to kind of, would it be fair to say you haven't really gotten to know Jon Burge, but you have a nuanced view of him. You don't see him as just being just like a criminal who likes to beat people up.
No, I think Jon Burge is in some ways a creature of our own devising, that he became what he is because the society around him let him become that. When he joined the police force, police brutality was fairly common. If you look at, in fact, the first allegations of electric shock occur in 1973. That very year, the Tribune did a 8-part series on police brutality, mostly having to do with street stops, but nonetheless very severe police brutality. They didn't get into electric shock or anything like that, but So I think Burge fit into a system in which he just had a better tool. And he came back from Vietnam, where he'd been part of a unit that took part in torture. They were military police on an army base in Vietnam, and various men I've interviewed there have said they were present for, they participated in torture. And so I think he came back and said, let me show you what I could do.
So he had been where the pros were doing it, and he had learned a few things.
Yes, but I think if his supervisors had, the first time he roughed somebody up, had said, I'm sorry, we don't do this here, and do that again, you'll be guarding the parking lot at police headquarters. We wouldn't be sitting here today.
Well, actually, that's an interesting topic that we have to talk about further down in our discussion, but just the idea that, almost setting aside everything else, the amount of damage that may have been done to the police department by this is significant, and I think we should talk about that. There's a quote, though, that you, I took this off of your Vocalo blog, and I just think it's so interesting, by Jon Burge, who was, you can refresh our memory, he was
the sergeant under Jon Burge. He was often referred to as Burge's right-hand man.
You called him up after Burge got convicted, and you asked him for a comment, and he said, society demands a lot of its police officers, and rightfully so, but when some in society get a peek at the underbelly of police work, i.e. homicide investigations, they squeal like stuck pigs. They take convicted murderers' outrageous allegations as gospel. They demand the heads of dedicated police officers on a stick. And unfortunately, a compliant liberal media has carried their water, giving convicted murderers a virtual stage to shout out their lies and embellish them for over 2 decades. There's a lot of people who probably agree with that, right?
Well, certainly there are people on the police force from that era who would agree with that. I've had men who served at Area 2 tell me, I was there. They didn't tell me. They would have told me. I was in the inner circle. Mm-hmm. But the evidence is just overwhelming. More than 100 cases against the same group of policemen spread out over almost 30 years. Mm-hmm. And if you chart, people say, well, they were making these allegations to beat a confession. It didn't work. Judges didn't suppress confessions. When Andrew Wilson came in, and he had alligator clip marks in his ears that indicated that he'd been given they indicated that alligator clips had been attached to his ears. Mm-hmm. He said that was attached to an electrical device. He had 14 injuries documented by Mercy Hospital. He had radiator burns on his chest, and the judge still didn't suppress his confession. So this whole idea that it was a conspiracy to suppress confessions, you would have done better just saying, I got beaten up, mm-hmm. than to make up this story about electric shock and suffocation.
And you also made a very interesting observation in one of your blog posts about the ears, about Andrew Wilson's ears, that Jon Burge could have risen quite rapidly and high in the police department, possibly, except for those alligator clip marks on the ears.
Well, I think he did rise rapidly and high. He was a commander when he was thrown off the force, and that so he's in the top 100 people on a 13,000 member force. But these alligator clip marks proved to be his undoing, I think, because what happened was Wilson said that they put the clips on his ears, and that he was able to, by moving around, to get them off, whereupon they stretched him in a different position. So he had one hand handcuffed to a ring in the wall, the other to a radiator, and he's forced up against a radiator while he was being given electric shock, in order to stabilize him, to keep him from doing this. But the burns on his chest then resulted, and that too people cite as, how do you explain that? Mm-hmm. There is no radiator in the police lockup, and he had them on his chest when he arrived at Cook County Jail.
So we are at a situation now where there is one conviction of Jon Burge, and that sentencing will happen in November. I presume he's back in Florida, right? Living in Florida now for the time being.
I don't know where he is at the moment.
I thought I had read that he had, but anyway, that's not the point. There are other people who have been involved in this. Burge was not acting alone. Will any of these come to trial? Is there any reasonable way to know whether there'll be more trials about this?
Well, Patrick Fitzgerald says they aren't finished. The problem Fitzgerald faces is not that other officers didn't lie, because other officers did lie and lied well after Burge lied. Burge, they had to indict Burge by 2008. November 2008, because that was when the 5-year statute of limitations expired on those written interrogatories. But others gave depositions into 2008, so the 5-year statute would allow Fitzgerald to indict in 2013.
I see. So he's still got a little time.
Yes, but the difficulty is that torture happens in a closed room. So you have perhaps 2 officers and a victim. It's the victim's word against the 2 officers. Now, if those officers have said, we didn't torture anybody, and now they're indicted for lying, and you have to put this witness on the stand, well, it's his word against theirs. Unless you have some... what killed Burge was really not the 5 victims who testified against him, but the sole significant officer who testified against him. And he was given immunity from prosecution, and he said that he had seen Burge put something transparent over a man's face. The man said that he'd been suffocated with a typewriter cover, and there was no way out of that. Burge couldn't come up with a logical explanation for how that detective could have been mistaken.
But now, you've also written that there are, if I remember correctly, there are 20 other people in prison now.
Yes.
Who could conceivably, what? They could bring their own charges. They could sue.
They could. Well, not yet. They would. Their ability to file a civil suit has long passed. They've been in jail for many years. What is possible now is for them to perhaps get a new hearing. If a judge says, yes, in the wake of this verdict and other evidence, I believe that we should have a hearing on whether this confession was tortured out of this person, then you would have that person take the witness stand, describe what happened, and then the state, the way it usually works is the state then puts on the police officers who then would say, never happened. But in this case, the state can't do that because those officers will not take the stand, say that it never happened, and risk prosecution for perjury.
For perjury.
Yes. So
because that's what they're afraid of now is perjury.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
So it's likely that anybody who gets a new hearing is going to get a new trial. If they get a new trial, the state has to make the case on the basis of just the evidence and any eyewitnesses that might have been there. They can't use the confession. If some of those men then end up getting freed, they can file a petition for a certificate of innocence. If they get that certificate of innocence, then they can file a suit on the basis of having been wrongfully convicted, and they can sue the city.
Let's talk about a journalistic question here. There's been some dispute that I've been reading on various blogs about. Do we have to stop using allegedly anymore on this? Can we now say that torture occurred in Area 2 in those years? Has it been determined as a fact?
Well, in 1990, the Office of Professional Standards of the Police Department used the word torture twice. They used it. One investigator used it to describe what happened to Andrew Wilson. She said electric shock had been given to Andrew Wilson. Electric shock, by anybody's definition, is torture. And the other investigator, Michael Goldston, he concluded that there had been systematic abuse at Area 2, including, quote, planned torture. In 1994, the city of Chicago admitted that Andrew Wilson and Melvin Jones had both been given electric shock at Area 2. That, by anybody's definition, is torture. in 2000, federal judges have used the word torture to describe what happened at Area 2. The special prosecutor, the Cook County special prosecutor, used the word torture to describe what happened at Area 2. I don't know why you would not use it.
Okay, so we no longer have to say that Jon Burge allegedly tortured people during his career with the Chicago Police Department. We can just say he did it.
Yes, and
I ask you that because you're pretty scrupulous about these things.
You can't say he's been convicted of torture because he hasn't.
Right, right. But you can say that it happened.
Yes.
It definitely happened.
Yes.
So I want to ask you a larger, more contextual question. I read, I believe, in the Tribune, and forgive me for not being able to cite this, but I read that someone has said that this most recent tragic shooting on the South Side, the officer who was just killed, is the third in a very short period of time, and that this is the most concentrated period of police assassinations in about 30 or 40 years, which pins it right around the time of Jon Burge. And I don't want to engage in rampant speculation here, but I'm wondering, are we in a period where the sort of the public zeitgeist is similar to what it might have been at that time? Is it? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, a lot of people are really freaked out about what's going on with police killings right now. I mean, this notion that thugs can walk up to a police officer who is off duty but in uniform and be completely undeterred by that and just shoot the guy in cold blood. That freaks out the public in a way that forgive me for saying normal police shootings don't, or killings. Are we in a period that is similar to what might have given rise to the Burge activity?
Well, the Burge activity started independent of police shootings. The torture began in 1973, the electric shock. So that was not connected to any police shooting. The incident you're talking about in 1982, there was an assassination of 2 police officers by Andrew Wilson. And that was that occurred, I think, in a much more charged atmosphere. There were 2 Irish-American officers shot by 2 African Americans on the South Side. There had recently been a Cook County Sheriff's deputy who was moonlighting at a McDonald's. He'd been shot dead and in Area 2, and the week before an officer had been shot on a bus. All these incidents connected to Andrew Wilson. And so there was this fever pitch. The mayor, I think, Jane Byrne, got on the television, offered a reward. It was a much more racially polarized time than it is now. And so I think it was a different kettle of fish. Now, yes, people are very upset, but I don't see that same sort of atmosphere developing here.
Well, on Sunday morning, the Tribune website had Mark Donahue, the president of the police union, a quote from him that I found really interesting. And again, I want to be very careful about what we're saying here. I'm not raising this to make any accusations. I just want to try to get a feeling of what we're in for here. And I thought this was a pretty provocative quote. He said, "Times have come where we have to readjust how we police to bring situations like this to an end. It's time to let the police be the police and take the handcuffs off the police, tighten up the rules and regulations in our court system. We need to do something." And again, I can't help but believe that that's someone who is speaking for a lot of people. If you read, and I don't know how representative they are, but certainly if you read the comment boards on all the different papers and blogs, you find a lot of that that emotion, that it's like this notion that the police have been shackled for so long, that they're not allowed to do their jobs, that the courts let criminals off willy-nilly, and it's time to clean this up and let the cops get out there and clean the streets up.
Well, these shootings don't have anything to do with the police not being able to do their jobs. I mean, if you look at this last shooting, it wasn't a policeman who was trying to bring in a suspect and had to be careful of the suspect in some way because of some law that's been passed. It was a man who was washing his car. And so, that doesn't make sense to me, that this whole idea of letting the police be the police. If we had let the police be the police, how would that have prevented this shooting from occurring? It wouldn't have.
Well, that's the thing that occurs to me too, is that I'm not aware that there are rules and regulations on the police that prevent them from doing their job. But I think it's very easy to confuse the public at a time like this and to say this is happening because there are restrictions on us, or the other thing is this notion that the courts are too lenient, that they're letting these criminals out too easily. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not a great student of recidivism and the court practices, but the jails are more full now than they ever were, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So if anything, there's more criminals in jail now than ever before. It just doesn't make sense to me, Ken.
Mm-hmm. You've written about your frustration as a journalist, that you spent so much time writing about this, about torture, about just gross misconduct on the part of police that really stained the entire police department. And that really, when you get right down to it, at the end of the day, people just didn't really care about it. Even the news media didn't really pick up on it for years and years and years. And that it's basically because all of us just really don't want to know about it. I mean, we've read a couple of interesting quotes here today, but I'm also reminded of that great, the Jack Nicholson soliloquy in A Few Good Men. It's like, you don't want to know what I do to provide you the blanket of peace that you live under, and you can thank me if you want, but I know you won't because you don't appreciate what I do. I mean, I am concerned that this is the environment that allows the kind of thing you've written about to happen.
I don't think that community indifference has changed. I think that it's a constant, not just in our society, but in every society. I think there's a torturable class. I think there's a group of people who are beyond the pale of our compassion, and nobody much cares what happens to them. And that group differs from place to place. Sometimes it's a religious group, Jews certainly in Germany, and Arabs in the West Bank, Arabs in Israel. I think the right in Cuba and the left in Chile. So there's just this capacity in human beings, I think, to not want to know about torture, and to not want to care much about the people who get tortured, to think that they're just not, that there's something wrong with them anyway, and they're less than us, and so therefore whatever happens to them is okay.
Something that you've written about yourself in your book on torture. You've actually done the dirty work of reporting on torture in various places. And also, we should point out your very fine piece of work on Ireland, Belfast Diary, which we probably should just find another half hour to talk about sometime, because that's kind of how you got involved in being a journalist, and you've had such a you've done such remarkable work on all of this for Chicago. Chicago owes you a debt, and I certainly hope to see you working for a major news outfit someday in the very near future.
Thank you, Ken.
Jon, thanks so much for being with us today. I
Happy to
really
be here.
enjoyed talking with you, and I think your perspective is something that's really worthwhile, and I'm really glad you joined us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Remember that you can see this and all of these programs here on CAN TV, or you can watch them anytime on Blip TV. Just check us out there. We'll see you next time on Chicago Newsroom, and thanks very much for watching.